Hello and welcome to Take Two, the programme that takes a second look at the big issues. I'm Henshall. Today our correspondent Fran reports on the case of a jailed peace activist making waves in Ireland, and Roy Hunter on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But first, here are some news shorts. The surveillance leaks from the US National Security Agency continue. It's hard to keep up with them, but we're trying. First though, the grip of the US secret state seems to be weakening a little as it becomes clear, despite Obama's smooth talking, just how flagrantly illegal the blanket surveillance is. It has been confirmed that for several years, the so-called FISA court, which gives legal cover to the elite snoopers, did not even bother to write an opinion to justify the secret court orders they were issuing to internet providers and phone companies. The recent panel appointed by the US Congress has held that Obama's snooping is clearly illegal. Legal eagles say that the writers of the US Constitution were one step ahead of those who now control Washington. Listen carefully. This is what the Fourth Amendment says. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that includes laptops obviously, shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. How different the reality is now. Here in the EU, the Daily Telegraph reports that police are secretly developing a remote stopping device to be fitted to all cars that would allow the police to disable vehicles at the flick of a switch from a control room. Confidential documents from a secret meeting of senior EU police officers have set out a plan entitled Remote Stopping Vehicles, as along with other surveillance and tracking measures. The devices, which could be in all new cars by the end of the decade, would be activated by a police officer working from a computer screen in a central headquarters. Meanwhile, German journalist Lars Schall has dug up a Reagan-era documentary from PBS television entitled Follow the Money. It quotes national security staff discussing the mission they were already working on in the 80s, real-time electronic surveillance of all bank transactions. Does anyone really think this system was introduced to the bizarre and largely uninvestigated official story of the 9/11 attacks? Critics of blanket US-UK snooping and US drone strikes are beginning to use the M word, M for murder. The Guardian reports that, quotes, a huge swathe of GCHQ mass surveillance is illegal, says top lawyer. British spy agency is using gaps in regulation to commit serious crime with impunity. How serious? Well, how about murder? In the UK Parliament, MP Tom Watson, who exposed the phone hacking scandal and chairs the all-party parliamentary group on drones, has been handed a legal opinion that confirms the sharing of intelligence used in US drone strikes could make UK spies accessories to murder. False flag terrorism. It's only a week or two since the US Super Bowl became the forum for what mainstream media call conspiracy theories. In other words, the increasingly obvious involvement of elements of the US government and allies like the Saudis in the 9/11 attacks. But the so-called conspiracy theories have even more traction outside NATO's controlled media. For instance, there has been minimal reporting of the suspicions of President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan. Even though he was installed by the NATO-led invaders, Karzai now believes they are working with the Taliban to create false flag terror attacks and destabilize his regime. An unusual report in the Washington Post confirms that, as well as criticizing US drone strikes and other attacks on Afghan villages, Karzai has, as they put it, been building a far broader case against the Americans, suggesting that they may have aided or even conducted shadowy insurgent-style attacks to undermine his government, according to senior Afghan officials who've spoken to the Post. Karzai has formalized his suspicions with a list of dozens of attacks that he believes the US government may have been involved in. You have to read quite a long way through the article to find out the suspected US motive. The complex assaults, they explain, often happened shortly after US airstrikes left civilians dead in other areas and might have been aimed at drawing attention away from those casualties. Another goal that the Post doesn't mention at all might be to destabilise the Karzai government so that it feels the need to call for continued US military presence. Meanwhile, back in the US, eminent lawyer William Pepper has taken the brief of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, writing to the US Commerce Department to demand a real investigation into the bizarre 7-second collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, some 6 hours after the Twin Towers were destroyed on 9/11. Building 7 was staffed with sensitive government offices and contained vital records in the prosecution of Bush allies, the Enron Corporation, for fraud. In 1999, Pepper convinced a US jury that Martin Luther King was murdered in a political plot, but the mainstream media mostly ignored the devastating finding. Nonetheless, Pepper is one of the few lawyers to make any inroads into the wall of silence on a string of sinister events, including the murder of President John Kennedy and later his brother Robert, as well as the Martin Luther King hit. Meanwhile, in New York, activists with NatCan are campaigning for a referendum to force a genuine investigation into what really caused the collapse of Building 7. Politicians question US role in UK for the first time in decades. Peers in the House of Lords call for a proper scrutiny of American military bases in the UK used for drone strikes and mass spying. UK authorities are not keen to advertise their role as America's aircraft carrier in Europe, and US bases are misleadingly given RAF designation, Royal Air Force designation. Last year, The Independent discovered that the US Air Force base known as RAF Crowton was functioning as a CIA relay station in Northamptonshire, used to funnel back to Washington data from the network of diplomatic spy posts implicated in the monitoring of the mobile phone of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Now, reports The Independent, scrutiny of American military bases in Britain could be increased dramatically for the first time in more than 60 years under cross-party proposals provoked by evidence that the installations are being used for drone strikes and mass spying activities. Draft proposals tabled by peers from all major parties demand that the government overhaul the outdated rules under which the Pentagon's network of UK outposts operate, following claims of British complicity in the US drone missions in the Middle East and eavesdropping in European allies. 79-year-old peace activist with cancer jailed in Ireland. Veteran peace activist and playwright Margareta D'Arcy, aged 79, has been jailed for obstructing a runway at Shannon Airport, Ireland's second biggest airport. She'd refused to sign a bond that would bar her from occupying any unauthorised area of the airport. She's in poor health and suffers from Parkinson's disease as well as cancer. So Fran, why did this woman who is quite frail get herself arrested like this?
Well, Ian, Margareta D'Arcy, a peace activist, is currently in Limerick jail serving a 3-month sentence for occupying a runway used by US military planes flying to the Middle East. It was to mark the 9th anniversary of the US-led war on Iraq. Margareta had been protesting about the years of complicity by the Irish government in the US war crimes. She particularly likes to focus on the effect war has upon women and children. There is some evidence that Shannon Airport may also have been involved in extraordinary rendition, whilst there was never any attempt for flight inspections by the Irish authorities to find this out. She also wanted to protest that Irish neutrality had been broken by providing the airport to the US military for waging illegal wars. Margareta had been asked to sign a bond that, as you said, which would promise she wouldn't obstruct the runway, but she refused to sign it. Incidentally, many aren't aware that the Irish government waives the air traffic control fees for the US military on a reciprocal basis, when ironically the Irish military don't even enter US airspace.
So what do Irish politicians think about this?
Well, Ian, her case was discussed at the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, and Eamon de Valera's grandson, Eamon O'Keefe, said he knew her and that her imprisonment offended human rights. There's quite a lot of support for her to be released on humanitarian grounds, and some are concerned at the bad image this case gives Ireland internationally. There is international support. Margareta's son, Finn Arden, thanked the wife of the island's president for visiting Margareta, as they'd both been long-term friends, and he hopes that Margareta may be released.
So there is a campaign to get her released?
Yes, definitely, Ian. 500 of Ireland's artists, actors and musicians are joined by international groups who are petitioning President Michael Higgins to release her, especially as she has cancer and Parkinson's disease. Dublin musician Dylan Tye says the President could use his powers to ask the government to pardon and free Margareta, and it's perverse that bankers and politicians who ruined this country are free while an elderly peace activist is jailed. A Fianna Fáil councillor for the Shannon area criticised protesters as being out of the local area and claimed most locals are pro-American due to traditional links and to US companies at Shannon providing jobs. But Margareta's supporters reply that they are just pro-peace and would demonstrate against any country's military if they thought it necessary to do so. Protesting the US military presence has nothing to do with being pro or anti-American, and some protesters are even those employed by US companies near Shannon. Her son says, since when does any Irish person, wherever they live, have to be anti-American to not want US drones using their country as a stepping stone to terrorise other people? And Sam Weinstein said, as an American, I fully support Margareta's actions. We in the US need all the help we can get from people like her in every country in the world to stand up or lie down and resist. So Margareta apparently is now concerned about prison conditions for the women in Limerick jail and will probably be campaigning for their rights once she's released. She's a veteran of the historic Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp set up in the 1980s to protest against the use of common land for the US military who stored cruise missiles there. And this use of common land had debated legality, and at its height there were thousands of protesters camped out all around the perimeter of the base. Eventually the US left and the land was returned to the people. A supporter of Margareta, Siobhan McMahon, says, what would James Connolly have said about this travesty of justice? Look at this quote from James Connolly. The Irish Republic must be made a word to conjure with, a rallying point for the disaffected, a haven for the oppressed, a point of departure for the socialist, enthusiastic in the cause of human freedom. The Global Women's Strike issued a statement in support of Margareta saying, while war criminals are allowed to pass through Irish airports and financial criminals go unpunished, the Irish state, enthralled to the US, the UK, the EU and IMF Masters of War, has imprisoned a pensioner who has dedicated herself to highlighting and preventing war crimes.
And what can people do to support this campaign?
Contact the Global Women's Strike. They held a protest in support of Margareta, demanding she be released, outside the Irish Embassy in London on January the 22nd. They urged people to sign their petition by going to their website, and you can also go to Margareta D'Arcy's website, and you can sign an international petition to the Irish Justice Minister.
Well, let's hope that the Irish government releases this woman, and or if they don't, that this becomes a global issue, because it puts its finger on so many different issues: the drone killings, the bankers, the prison conditions. Thanks very much, Fran. The Trans-Pacific Partnership: trade deal or corporate takeover? The Trans-Pacific Partnership and its European equivalent, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TPP and the TTIP, to give them their acronyms, seem to be more about giving corporations legal parity with nation states than being about trade per se. Negotiated between the US and 12 Pacific Rim countries, essentially everyone in the area except for China, the TPP is being aggressively promoted by US business interests. Along with the TTIP, it would form a trade alliance in which corporations would have veto power over many nations' law. Should a country wish to strengthen environmental laws, food safety standards, health, privacy, internet freedom, copyright, or other public safety issues, the corporations may sue that country for undermining their so-called future expected profits, essentially forcing nations to have future laws vetted by the corporations. Failure to comply would be punishable by massive fines and trade sanctions. This seems like a massive shift of power towards the corporations. Our correspondent Roy Hunter has been digging deeper. Roy?
Hi Ian. Yes, it's a nasty piece of legislation, this one. And I'll just go through a few recent examples, and this is before the laws have been passed. So in Ecuador, Occidental Petroleum Corporation, even though that they'd come foul of a clause that was written into their contract, Ecuador tried to cancel their drilling license because it stipulated in the contract that if they did this certain thing, then their license would be revoked. So Ecuador revoked it, and the petroleum company took them to court and fined them $2.3 billion.
Wow.
So,
and this is similar phrasing in a different law. That will be NAFTA or something, probably, the American free trade. It's the same format, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a few laws they've been trying to get through that have been defeated, basically. And as we always see, if you defeat them in one area, they change everything slightly.
Come back round the back road.
And of course, this is all being done in secret. So
it's only because of leaks that we even know what they're talking about. And the US Congress isn't allowed to read the planned legislation or something?
Well, they're allowed a certain amount of access to it, but very, very little, really. And also, America's trying to get fast track on it. So if Obama's given fast track, that means there's only a limited debate in Congress and no amendments are allowed.
Well, we certainly recall this situation. Congress signs all its rights given in the Constitution over to the presidency. Well, that wouldn't be the first time that had happened, would it?
So, you know, a bit more dictatorship is always good for us. But there's another mechanism here, which I've never come across before, which is sign up without completion. So once this bill reaches a certain point, all the nations will sign up to it, but it's not even complete. So after they've signed up to it, they're still making the law.
So they want them to sign up before they've actually made the treaty. They're signing up to literally a blank check.
Blank check,
How extraordinary.
And it basically means that, you know, because we've got the TPP, which is the US and 12 Pacific Rim countries, and then we've got a very, very similar bill going through called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and that's between basically the US and Europe, really. And they're very similar. The end results can be very similar with them. And basically what that would mean is that if the UK is making any regulation or legislation, we're basically going to have to clear that with the US.
So, well, with this new structure. And I wonder if the NHS, maybe they'll say, maybe an American medical company might say that by not letting them operate in England on an NHS hospitals, that somehow we all get fined.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute. If I can just give you a couple more examples that have already happened, even before the legislation's passed, is Philip Morris is making a claim against the Australian government because the Australian government want to bring in plain cigarette packaging.
So the cigarette companies are using it?
Yeah. Oh, all the corporations are going to use it.
You'd think they'd be a little bit embarrassed about a cigarette company forcing people to, encouraging people to smoke.
I don't think they're very embarrassed about very much these days.
They don't have to bother any longer.
And also in Quebec, there's a company there taking the Quebec government to court because they're imposing a moratorium on fracking. So and that's happening now before the TPP's been signed.
So all this fracking debate will be almost just worthless then if we're forced to allow it.
Well, I mean, this is what's happening really. Basically, this is the end of regulation really by government.
By governmental regulation, just the lowest common denominator. But even then, there must be some limits to this, Roy. I can't really believe that.
Well, there's bound to be limits.
Yeah.
But then you know, the limits in practice and the limits on paper are other things. And don't forget that the illustrations I'm giving you now are before the law's passed even. We've also got a Swedish company suing the German government because the German government's decided to dismantle its nuclear power program. So a Swedish company's suing them for lost profits. But it's the usual corporate agenda, really. I mean, we've seen, most of these things that are already coming through. There's 15 lawyers. There's 15 lawyers that have done 55% of the
work on it.
The work on these cases, and those 15 lawyers.
15.
And these 15 lawyers are allowed to. There'll be a judge in one case, and then there'll be a corporate lawyer for the corporation in the next case. So it's all a big revolving door. So it's all run by the corporations, and most of this legislation, of course, is written by the corporations as well.
Yeah, without any reference to the legislators.
Yeah. But so what this is basically a harmonisation of all the regulatory laws, really. And of course, what it's going to be is the lowest common denominator, isn't it?
Race to the bottom.
Yeah, race to the bottom. For instance, they're going to use it in the US in particular. They're very, very upset about the EU ban on dipping of meat in chlorine. So any meat coming out of the abattoir is dipped in chlorine, which stops it discolouring.
Yeah.
Which is banned in the EU. Which
right. So American meat isn't the right colour.
That's right. Well, it's a nicer colour.
I'm sure there are plenty of good people in America making good meat, by the way.
But I mean, to me, the biggest danger that this flags up is that half the US states are now considering GMO labelling.
Yes. Are they going to try and get that stopped?
Well, I think so, yes. It does seem to be... it says here, this is the US National Confectioners Association has bluntly stated, US industry also would like to see the US-EU FTA achieve progress in removing mandatory GMO labelling and traceability requirements.
Traceability requirements?
Yeah.
Well, that's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, to be fair, I think what some of the proponents would say, they'd refer back to the situation 30 or 40 years ago, and they'd say, look, what was happening then was a company would go to its government, because in those days companies generally were in one country or another, and they'd think, well, to protect ourselves against foreign competition, let's get some dodgy safety laws written in which only we can comply with. And this used to happen a lot in the motor industry. So I mean, to put both sides of the case, sure. I think that's the case, is that governments don't always bring in regulations for benign motives. They sometimes do it because they've been captured by their local industry and they just want to keep out competition. But of course, the pendulum swung back quite a long way in the other direction since those days.
Well, I think I think a lot of these things do start off on with a reasonable framework. But then, all the lobbyists, that's what lobbyists are paid for, really, isn't it? To expand that framework and to... but we've also a few other things here that are going to be in danger is the pharmaceutical firms, the copyright on drugs and things like this. There's a thing called evergreening, where a company can have a patent on a certain drug for 20 years and then in tablet form, and then when that patent comes to an end, they can start doing that drug in a capsule form and get another 20 years.
Crikey.
And then as an injection.
Well, this patent issue, that's another whole report for you, Roy, I reckon, this patent issue and copyright, because you've got Walt Disney. Mickey Mouse, is still in copyright, but we're digressing. Thanks very much, Roy. Well, that brings today's show to a close. Thanks very much for watching. Thank you to The People's Voice for screening us. You can catch us on YouTube, RADTV UK. Thanks for watching. See you next time.